The good news on this front certainly is that your house installment hasn't changed, and neither has your car installment, because that has remained unchanged. The interest rate on it remains with the prime lending rate of 10% and the repo rate of 6.5%. Still continuing to unpack that decision by Lesetja Kganyago and the Monetary Policy Committee, a 7-member MPC. This is one of the first meetings where we had 7 out of 7 gentlemen. We had 7 members, so we didn't need Lesetja Kganyago to cast a deciding vote. But we do have Brian Khan as well stepping down at the end of September. He's been advisor to the Reserve Bank governor for some time now. Do you think that bears any influence on future decisions?
Not to my mind. I think there's been a significant level of consistency. There's a smooth handover process, and I think everyone's on the same page. I don't think there will be any change whatsoever.
Yeah. Yourself, Viv?
Yeah, I think we don't bring mavericks onto the board here. We basically have a bunch of people with the same view. They may be slightly different, but they're not giving a radically different view as to what's happening.
Yeah. Gentlemen, we had many issues that were unpacked as well by the Reserve Bank governor, even though the speech is shortened. Global tension, a very big one and contentious one. We know exactly what the stories are, don't we? China, Russia, even in Saudi Arabia, etc. as well. How much should we be worried about those factors in the South African context, Jason?
We should be very worried. If you consider that the US has imposed tariffs on Chinese steel, and then you think about where Chinese steel comes from, it's made with South African iron ore, and we're already starting to see the impact there. So not only that, but from a currency point of view, we do remain at risk, and the governor was very clear about that.
Yeah, the trade war tension with, even with China right now is bound to continue. More than $200 million worth of goods being increased with regards to tariffs. That's going to hurt not just China and the US, but clearly globally.
Oh yeah, most certainly. And the thing is that what we fail to consider sometimes is that there's not just politics in the US, there's also politics in China as well. So Trump has come out and said, okay, we have 500 billion we import from you, import 150 billion from us. Look, we're going to win this easily.
Yeah. But
they forget that, trade wars, particularly in China, have more of a cultural aspect than they have in more other parts of the world because of some of the historic stuff they've had done to them by some of the colonial powers. So it actually, if you look at some of the Chinese newspapers, they talked about things like the Opium Wars,
yes.
From 100+ years ago. And there's things that are culturally very sensitive about being pressured by an outside power. But let's not forget what's happening in the EU as well. Remember, Trump we talked about what was his competitors/foes.
Yes.
He put the EU #1 and China #2. And the EU is a big economy. And you see what's happening with Google right now with regards to that 4.5 billion euro fine. I think it's 2 weeks of revenue for Google, so it's not a big deal. But, the European Union has really been left out of the entire tech, industry, quite frankly.
Yeah.
There's not a single big European tech company out there. So they're trying to basically get that industry going. And it's one of the things that they can actually really target. Like the Americans can target cars, the Europeans can target the tech industry as the way to fight back against the US. And that's something that I think we're going to be seeing going forward. Not just overall trade wars, but certain industries being targeted by their competitors.
Should we be worried about Europe in itself with regards to trade? I mean, they're still sorting out their own issues with regards to Brexit. They don't seem to be too stable either. Should we be concerned with that? Will it play a factor at some point in the thinking of the Reserve Bank?
Actually, one of the things that I think like the Trump situation actually makes Europe more stable, because Europe has a lot of inconsistencies in that economy because of the Germans being so much bigger, so much faster growing, the Southern Europeans, the refugee situation and how it's happening in Italy. The fact of the matter is that we had some very strange winners in the Italian elections, and if you look at who the people are, it's like Trevor Noah winning the election. I'm not joking, that's what it is. It's like, Chester Missing winning the election.
Sure.
That's what happened in Italy. And it's the 3rd biggest economy in Europe. But the fact of the matter is that one thing that unites Europe is the fact that they hate Donald Trump, and that it kind of brings them together.
Yeah.
So we are going to see, politically it's very easy for these countries to basically push back against Trump because it's a winning political situation back home. And that's the danger. When these things become political as opposed to economic, like in China, like in the US, like in Europe, and then we see the economy suffering because people aren't thinking what's good for the economy, they're thinking what's good for them in the polls.
Yeah. Jason, the Reserve Bank governor mentioned that and said that it wasn't as big an impact as he thought it would be. I'm certainly as surprised as I think he is.
Well, it's good news in one sense, because it means that they didn't have to raise the interest rate today.
Yeah.
But what it is symptomatic of is very weak domestic demand, and that was something that's raised. So if you look at some of the retail numbers that have come out recently, they've been really poor, and the share prices have reflected that. I think it just means that because South African consumers are so stretched, they're not able to pass on those costs. If we consider that food price inflation remains relatively contained, that's certainly helping. But the average household is now having to apportion a significant more money towards transport costs. We've had petrol prices go up by R2 in the last 3 months, and that's significant. So there's a lot more money having to be allocated to that.
I know that we've heard from government in saying that they can't do much about that petrol price, but in your mind, do you think that we should reopen that discussion and really think about ways to perhaps levy fuel for perhaps different parts of that fuel price that need to be looked at in a different way?
It's certainly worth the discussion, but I'm not sure how productive it's going to be, because we are now funding a great deal through for the road accident fund, and if we are not recovering the money through higher VAT and higher fuel prices, we're just going to have a bigger deficit, which would lead us down the path of further downgrades. And that's certainly not something we need either.
That's something we haven't spoken about in a while, Viv. Downgrades in South Africa. We seem to have passed that bug on. Are we at any risk of it, do you think, in the next 6 months or so?
Those wage negotiations are a big deal. The fact of the matter is that if we have above inflation wage negotiations happening in the public sector, it does really reduce our fiscal standing. And that's something we need to be concerned about. Of course, some of the other factors, like, for instance, growth rates, etc., very important. If we could grow at 5% a year, there would never be a downgrade.
Yeah.
Okay, the fact of the matter that we grow at 1.2 and trying to get up to 1.7, and 2% in a couple of years' time, that's the real issue. But I think the wage negotiations are really key, because if the government's going to be paying above inflation increases, it means they have no power to control these wage negotiations. We were talking in the break about the fact that Eskom, which is the big behemoth, is the 8,000-pound gorilla when it comes to the SOEs, is producing less electricity with more workers and paying those workers multiples, not just a percentage or two higher, but multiples of what the average worker in South Africa makes. And so you have a scenario like that, what you're going to find is soon you run out of money from other sectors, and you basically have the government guarantees coming into play, etc. And that really, I think Eskom especially, is really a very big chink in the armor of government's fiscal stability.
Yeah. Continue with that Eskom discussion, Jason. It's certainly one that's going to be looked at now and always, and I don't think there's any way to really sort out their issues in the immediate term anyway.
Well, I think there's a lot that can be done. I wouldn't say we should be giving up. We can sell other assets to fund some of the infrastructure spend required by Eskom. We've seen it happen in Ethiopia, where they've just launched a 95% privately owned airline. We've seen it happen in India, where the government was selling down a big chunk of its stake. So there's definitely a movement in that direction. We just seem to be really resistant to do that. And I think part of that is the strength of the labour unions in South Africa.
Yeah.
And that again speaks to what Viv was saying in terms of the power of the labour unions demanding well above inflation increases, which is going to put significant pressure on the fiscus. And that just means we have less funding for social grants, for infrastructure spending, hospitals, policing, all of those things.
Yeah, and as you said then, if you're looking for private ownership, I mean, just take a look at SAA now saying to themselves, well, we certainly need somebody to step in at this point in time, and we need it urgently because the story is not that great.
Well, it's a positive story in that they're finally willing to admit that they need an equity partner.
Yeah.
Whether
a little too late?
I don't know if it's too late, but it's a good sign nonetheless. We'll take whatever good news we can get at this point.
Yeah.
But I just wonder whether they can find someone who's going to take on that bigger risk.
Wage increases, as we were speaking about there, Viv, if about a year and a half to 2 years ago we had spoken about wage increases of around 6.5%, which seems to be the case in some instances, right? I think you'd be okay because you'd think, yes, it's above inflation, but it isn't too much above inflation. We have inflation at 4.6%, averaging 4.8% for this year as expected by the South African Reserve Bank. 6.5% is almost 2% more than that.
Yeah.
That's a heavy risk.
And look, I mean, the reason that we have inflation targeting is to change inflation expectations and therefore change how people negotiate this cost of living increases.
Yeah.
That was the whole reasoning behind it. So we expected unions and other negotiators basically go out and say, hey, look, the inflation rate is 6%, we want 6.1, 6.2, that's a 1-2% real increase. It's now at 4.5, we want 4.6 and 4.7, that's a 1 or 2% real increase. Either it comes down to two things, either that negotiators on the part of labor don't believe that the government can maintain wages at the rate that they are, also inflation at the rate it is right now. I don't think that's true. And the second thing is just that once you've had these expectations built into the labor force wants 6%, irrespective of what the inflation rate is. So it's not a thing that goes up and down, it's just ratcheted up. We have 10%, we want more than 10%, but if we have 5%, we want basically the old 6 or 7% like it is normal.
I think there isn't that communication of change, really, if you ask me, with the sense that, people just think that, above inflation is anything above 6%, whereas inflation changes as a mark every single month as well. Just some of the other things that I guess we could look at, tightening of global conditions. Everyone seems to be increasing interest rates. We're staying behind. Do we eventually go up that mark and look at perhaps we need to keep up with global trends?
We've been out of sync with developed markets for some time now and been moving in the opposite direction. When they cut, we rise. So we will eventually have to move back in lockstep with them. We're now seeing that the US Fed is going to start raising interest rates, not very aggressively. The European Union's rolling back fiscal stimulus, which will end at the end of this year. And then towards the middle of next year, towards the end of 2019, they will also be in a position to start raising interest rates, which are at record lows, and they have been for an extended period of time. The risk we run is that we get caught out and we don't respond fast enough.
That's the problem, isn't it? The global synchronization of growth isn't something we're seemingly getting a hold of. Jerome Powell talking about an upbeat US economy. We, on the other hand, talking about a domestic outlook that seems to be benign, as as the word that the Reserve Bank governor. Are we doing enough to stimulate it?
Well, I think we're doing as much as we can in the current context. What is encouraging is that for the first time in a long time, it's external international factors and not local domestic factors that are hampering growth. Yes, we could do a lot more, and what we need is policy certainty. You're not going to attract foreign miners to come and invest in South Africa if there's no policy certainty around the mining charter. And we've seen the pressures that the gold manufacturers are under. Most of those mines are not even profitable.
Yeah, and 20% only.
And the wage negotiations are starting around 15 to 20% in terms of increases. So there's a lot of the severe impasses between labor, government and the private sector. I think until we can all come together, as they did in the US, when the global financial crisis struck, we're going to be in for a bumpy ride. Yeah.
Viv, as we continue this discussion, we also spoke earlier, as you said, just with regards to how we can make sure we remain a country that is attractive. Our bonds sitting at 8.75% as of 3:30. Do we remain attractive at these levels?
Look, how do we become attractive? Productive workers. You have productive workers, and you can pay those workers 5-6 times what the average worker in South Africa is being paid, and people will still flock to your country if the workers are productive. How do you get productive workers? Have the skills and have the infrastructure available, so the workers have the skills to produce, and the infrastructure in the country basically allows them to make the full advantage of those skills. Okay, that's what we need to do in the longer term to get to the point where, we talk about the fact that our workers are paid too much, etc. But compared to the world places we want to be like Norway, we want to be like Sweden, we want to be like America in terms of the wages. Those workers aren't fundamentally different from ours when they were born. It's what happened to them over the time from them till the time that they actually went into the workforce. It's also the situation that they are facing in the country. So those are the factors that government has to change, and government has control. Government controls the public education system, and government controls effectively public infrastructure. And so that's the long-term view, and we have to change that. In the shorter term, look, it's obviously we've got to do certain things that make it more attractive to come to the country. Look, mining, tourism, farming, those things are nice, and they take a lot of time out of government's books. But really what we need to have in this country is low-cost manufacturing. That's how every single country in the world that you look at really that has managed to get itself to a point where it's gone from being poor to being slightly richer, like the East Asian tigers, those countries have all done it the same way. It's through manufacturing. And we in this country don't have a policy that really attracts manufacturing except by massive tax benefits and so on. We don't have a structured way, and we don't only want to go for the more expensive manufacturing of vehicles, whereas we should be creating irons, and we should be creating pens and pencils.
Should be creating a lot more with our industry. Very last word, Viv, I've literally got 10 seconds. The trajectory for interest rates for the remainder of the year, do you see another hike for the rest of the year at all?
No.
Yourself, Jason?
Flat.
certainly flat for the remainder of the year, is the word from the gentleman joining me this afternoon. Jason Muscat from FNB and Viv Govender from Rand Swiss. Well, that concludes just our look at the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, choosing to retain interest rates and keep them at 6.5% for the repo rate and 10% for the prime lending rate. We'll do this again on the 20th of September as the MPC's, the Reserve Bank's MPC meets again. It's goodbye from me for now.